Hello everybody and welcome to this month's webinar for young professionals. Before we get started, I want to introduce myself to those that may not recognize me or my name. I'm Matthew Fox, Community Development Manager here at CSI, and my coworker Caitlin Solomon is also on the call.
Hi guys, I'm Kate Solomon, CSI's Marketing and Membership Manager. Matt and I are glad to have you on our first live webinar of the Young Professionals series. For those of you who might not be aware, if you haven't viewed our introductory video, so YPS, or the Young Professional Series, Matt and I like to abbreviate, is our new content-driven campaign focused on young professionals in the industry, and it includes various age groups and experience levels, so we're excited to have a lot of you on the call today. And this series is really designed to provide industry education and professional development to empower you all to not only be change agents within your specific firm, but also within the industry. And a major part of how we're doing this is with our monthly webinar presentation like this one. And Matt, do you want to explain about the Project Team series?
Sure. So this series that we've been talking about a little bit and today that you're attending is a 10-part series currently. It may become more as we go down the road here with the idea of understanding the project team. This is something that CSI has talked about for many years at a very basic, I guess, 50,000 foot level of the project team representing the industries in the design side, the construction side, and the ownership side, but really breaking those down into a much more detailed understanding of who are the people that you either currently represent in this industry or that you will work with as you get more involved and more experience within the profession. So with that, the idea being that each of these months we will bring in guest speakers or panel discussions that represent a specific viewpoint of the overall project team, and during that period ask them to kind of give input from their point of view on how they represent that individual or individuals within the overall project, and then really allow for some conversation and discussion to happen between you all and the speakers about how you can expect to work with each other, and as you get more and more experience in the profession, ideally when is the best time just to reach out to these people. So it doesn't just become siloed aspects of the overall construction industry, but really is actually an entire series of individuals that you're expecting to work with and that you're familiar with and knowledgeable with prior to actually getting to the point of, owning your own firm or owning your own construction team or owning your own building, since we're talking about owners today as well. So the general concept here is a little bit different than what you may have experienced in previous practice groups or CSI education periods, in the sense that the audience will probably stay the same, but will be speaking to you from very different viewpoints each time. As a result, that may mean that at any given point, one of these sessions may be on your own topic, and you may feel that you don't need to attend that session. However, we recommend that you would attend it as well, or look for the recording afterwards, because it may be interesting to see how other people perceive the profession that you are currently participating in as well. And
like Matt says, we are really hoping for audience participation, and we encourage you to share what you're learning on today's webinar online. For attendees on Twitter, you can join me. I will be live tweeting from today's webinar using the hashtag CSIYPS, which is also mentioned in your chat box on the right side of your screen. Share notes, highlights, and questions on Twitter. A little bribery: at the end of today's presentation, I will choose from someone who is active online to win a CSI swag bag. So if you like winning free things, a little extra incentive to get involved on Twitter today. And then after the presentation, feel free to continue the conversation on the CSI Young Professionals LinkedIn group. You can submit questions or start discussions from today's webinar, or prepare for next month's topic.
So with that, all the background info is kind of out of the way. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. So as you see here on the screen, Mark Fisher is today's speaker to represent the owners as we start this presentation. Having recently joined Cassidy Turley, Mark is a senior leader responsible for managing, leading, and developing property management associates in order to enable them to deliver consistent, exceptional performance to the firm's clients and their tenants. He's also responsible for optimizing operational efficiencies throughout the Cassidy Turley portfolio, ensuring consistent and incomparable service delivery, and encouraging service standardization across regions, portfolio, and service lines. Prior to joining Cassidy Turley, Mark spent more than 22 years with Transwestern and its predecessor, the Carey Winston Company, starting as an assistant property manager and advancing to senior vice president with the operational responsibility across the entire Mid-Atlantic region. Mark was elected by BOMA International as an inaugural member of the BOMA Fellows Program in 2012. The individuals honored by BOMA Fellows have displayed exemplary and sustained contributions to the industry, their profession, and the community, and BOMA at all levels have continually answered the call to leadership and service throughout their careers. So it's with my great privilege that I introduce Mark Fisher to start today's session. Mark, over to you.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here, very happy to get an opportunity to speak with young professionals, something I feel very strongly about personally as well as within our company, and I want to make sure that we get all of your questions answered and make this a really worthwhile experience. I think when we talk about building owners or owners of commercial real estate, I think one of the things that's important to understand is maybe a little bit about the fact that the owner is probably not an individual, and there's many, many different ways that the ownership structure can occur. So I have a couple of slides in the very beginning which can be used to explain a little bit about commercial real estate so that we're all on the same page. The first slide talks about the different kinds of product types. Some owners specialize in just one product type. Some owners own multiple types of buildings. But in general, buildings are cataloged as offices. Office buildings could also be in an office park environment. Retail could include both larger shopping centers as well as malls. It could include neighborhood shopping centers, grocery-anchored shopping centers. There's very, very great specialization within the retail world. Warehouse space, industrial space, warehouses, distribution facilities, which are very, very different from a traditional warehouse. And then also, in occasion, the manufacturing facilities as well. Some will own residential, and certainly one thing that we've all seen recently is the concept of mixed use, and how throughout the portfolio we're seeing an incredible amount of growth in that particular area as folks want to live, work, and play in the same place. So for our discussion, I think it's first important to say there's a big difference between income-producing properties and non-income producing properties. The goals are very different. If you look at the bottom of the screen, that's non-income producing properties, things like government entities, nonprofit organizations, schools and religious institutions. All of those folks may own their own real estate, but the goal is not to produce income. The goal is not to create a financial incentive for the owner. The goal is to allow the government to do its work, to allow the nonprofit to do its mission, to allow the school and the religious facility to be present in the community. So ultimately, we will focus on income-producing properties because that's really my background. Certainly, if you have an owner that happens to be one of those non-income-producing properties, you may be serving them, but oftentimes their expectations are a little bit different. We're going to focus today on income-producing properties. That means that we're putting tenants into those buildings who are going to pay rent, is going to generate a return for the client, so that ultimately the owner of the building uses it as an investment vehicle. Sometimes we deal with individual owners, which are high-wealth individuals who may own a piece of commercial real estate. They run the gamut from a person who is an experienced real estate manager, developer, somebody who's got a ton of experience in real estate, to the person who had some extra money lying around and decided to invest in real estate. So one of the real challenges is sometimes with the individual owner, the property manager, asset manager, the people who are working on behalf of that person have a lot of work to do to explain how real estate really works. For the most part, because of the value of most of the real estate that occurs in our markets, most of the real estate that we deal with is owned by an institutional investor. So a pension fund, an insurance company, a large company that owns the building, and in most cases then there is a person called the asset manager who represents the owner throughout the process. So in our world, for the most part, the word owner and asset manager are synonymous with one another. The building itself may be owned by an entity that's out of the country, so maybe that person's coming from Abu Dhabi, or there's money coming in from some other place. The asset manager works on behalf of that entity to manage the real estate portfolio. So we may never ever speak with the owner. We will often speak with the asset manager. So typically you'll see the owner, underneath the owner will be the asset manager, underneath of the asset manager would be the property manager. And the asset manager's primary function is to create financial value. The property management's function is a little bit closer to the ground. It's a little bit more operational, but there is a value proposition there as well. So the asset managers themselves can come in many different forms. Some of our very large clients have an in-house asset management team, and some of them use a third-party firm. It really depends, both on the size and the complexity of the firm, as well as it could very well be that some companies just want to outsource that requirement. As you can see from the list, oftentimes what you're going to see happen is the in-house folks, people like individual owners, institutional investors, pension funds, real estate advisors, and even real estate investment trusts, which is a unique way of owning real estate that has some financial benefits for its owners. Some of those people do their asset management in-house. In some cases, the third party is either an independent asset management company or an investment management company, or it could be a big real estate firm like Cassidy Turley that would have its own separate division that does asset management. Many of the bigger firms who provide commercial real estate assistance have their own asset management groups. So we may be reporting to the asset manager, but at the end of the day, all of us work for the owner. So the property manager is focused on helping the owner achieve its objectives. The leasing team is focused on helping the owner achieve its objectives, and we report to an asset manager who has that very same responsibility. So no matter what happens, we all are responsible for helping that owner get the best financial value they can out of that piece of real estate. One of the things that is unique about the relationships that we have is this concept of fiduciary relationships. The fiduciary relationship is a very significant legal term, and it is a relationship that's characterized by confidence, good trust, good faith, reliance, and trust. It means that everything we do as a fiduciary has to be in the best interest of the client at all times. So the asset manager, the property manager, the leasing team, all of us have that fiduciary level of responsibility. That's more than, it's a very significant legal threshold, and we must act in a way that will protect the owner. In some cases, there may be opportunities where, in order for us to protect the owner, we may have to do something that is disadvantageous to our company. And it may be that we're working with the owner to reduce construction management costs or construction costs at a particular tenant improvement. That may, in turn, reduce our construction management revenue along the way. And even though that reduces my total profit for that assignment, it's in the best interest of the client, and I'm obligated to serve the client and not look for the best interest of my company as the first line. So the fiduciary responsibility is important, and I think that the take-home message is we have to always, always act in the best interest of the owner in every single decision that we make. And you know, it's a tough situation to be in, but we have to constantly protect the owner. So if you could summarize asset management in one word, what are we all about and what do we spend our time doing? All of us are aligned to do one thing and one thing only, and that is create value. Ultimately, our goal is to help the owner maximize its value of the asset so that the owner can achieve its financial objectives. Sometimes we're going to help the owner create value, and it may be that we would purchase a building, we would do some major improvements, we would lease the building up, and we would sell it. So we call that buy it, fix it, sell it, and then we reload the portfolio with another building that's in trouble. That focus is on creating value. So we buy a building at a certain dollar value, we fix it up, and we sell it, and we've created value in that process. Sometimes it is that we have a stable building, and we look to maximize the value. We're not trying to necessarily create it. We're just trying to maximize it and be as much, as maximum as we can. And that's where we start to look at creative ways to increase income or reduce expenses. During the last recession, though, we actually saw an opportunity for building values to decline. And in some cases, our job as the asset management team, property management team, leasing team is not necessarily to add value, because that's not going to happen during a recessionary time. It is to reduce the opportunity to lose value. So we're there to be the stopgap measure to try to keep the building as valuable as possible. We want to keep the tenants in place to make sure that the income is preserved. We want to try to reduce operating expenses. We want to do the things that we can do to help the building succeed despite the fact that the economy has changed dramatically. One of the reasons that we like value is that it's very, very easy to measure. So we can determine what the value of a piece of property is. We can determine what the value of the building is. And ultimately, in the commercial real estate world, when you're talking about income-producing properties, value is very, very closely tied to the amount of money that that building generates. So if you can imagine that in commercial real estate, what we're really buying is a cash flow of that building over a period of time. You're focusing less on the bricks and mortar cost of the building and the construction, and you're focusing more on the value of the cash flow that the tenants are paying into the building over the long term. So things that we do at the property can have an impact on value. If, for example, if let's say that we maintain the roof of the building really well, and we're able to take a roof that has a 20-year warranty, and we're able to hold that roof for 25 or 30 years. If we are able to defer that roof replacement for 5 or 10 years, that adds a tremendous amount of value to the property. If we did a 20-year roof, and we have a roof that's got a 20-year warranty, but we didn't maintain it well, the roof needs to be replaced at 15 years, then we actually damage the value of the building, because the cash flow was designed that for that 20-year period we wouldn't have to do a roof. Now we have to do one 5 years early, which has a dramatic impact on the cash flow. So ultimately, things that we do at the property can change the value. So all of us, from the leasing team, the property management team, and the asset manager, we are constantly focused on the concept of value and what can we do to maximize the value. So here's a couple of ways that we work to increase the value. The easiest, fastest, and most effective way to increase value of a real estate asset is to keep the tenants who are in the building in place for the long term. We want to make sure that we get those tenants to pay market-leading rents. We want the tenants to be high credit quality. We want to be people who are going to be able to sustain their obligations for the 5 or 10 or 7-year lease term, so that that's a stable tenant who's going to pay their rent for the duration of their lease. That is the absolute best way to preserve that asset value. When we have vacancy in the building, the best way to increase the asset value is going to be to sign new leases, bring in new tenants to fill those empty spaces. And that has a tremendous impact on value as well. Sometimes we also can do a little bit of small changes. So we might find some people who want to pay rent for antennas on the roof of a tall building. That can be a really interesting revenue stream, because cell phone carriers and a bunch of other different people will pay money on a commercial piece of real estate to put antennas on that real estate. It's not going to make a gigantic change in the cash flow of the building or the profitability or the value of the building, but every little bit helps. Certainly signage rights on the building. Sometimes we can charge a tenant for putting signage on the building, and oftentimes we can charge the tenant for storage. So if we've got some underground areas that can be turned into storage spaces, sometimes the tenant will pay rent on those spaces. The next opportunity is to reduce the operating expenses, and in doing so, that helps to increase the value. So today, because the real estate values declines so greatly over the last few years, one of the easiest ways to reduce the operating expenses at a building has been to appeal the real estate taxes. And the real estate taxes are, that's a major portion of the operating expenses of a building, and at the same time, because the values are much higher than what the value of the building would be today, in most cases that can be a substantial savings. So real estate managers are spending time and opportunity to reduce those operating expenses. On the opposite end of the spectrum, certain things can happen that cause the value of the property to decline. So if a tenant were to leave the building at the end of its lease and leave a vacancy, that would decrease the value of the property. And think of a commercial piece of real estate in the same way that you think of a hotel. So if a hotel doesn't rent a room tonight, they lose the revenue for that room for the entire, for history. They're never going to recoup the cost of that room on that particular night. So the idea behind it is an opportunity cost, that for every day that that space stays empty, the owner loses the opportunity to earn revenue on that space. So when the tenant leaves at the end of its lease, it can have a dramatic impact on the value. And sometimes, especially during the last real estate cycle, tenants go out of business in the middle of their lease and disappear in the middle of the night. And that also has a dramatic impact on the value of property. Sometimes those additional sources of revenue dry up. And back in the early days of my career, the cell phone antennas were less popular, but the companies that ran pagers, digital pagers, they used to pay a substantial amount of money to put pager antennae on the roof of a building. Well, that opportunity dries up as people no longer use pagers and have switched over to smartphones. That opportunity dried up, and those tenants are no longer paying roof rent. And then lastly, as real estate taxes increase, as inflation drives their operating expenses higher, that also has an impact on the value of the property. So you can see we're focusing a lot of attention on the details of the property to try to maximize the value. Ultimately, all of us are focused on getting results. So from time to time, things happen, and we have created a budget, we have a plan, but as soon as that budget is put into place and we hit January 1st, on January 2nd, the budget is probably outdated. So we're constantly rolling with the punches. We're constantly moving things around and trying to recuperate from things that might have happened over the past couple of months. So even though we have a plan, the plan is probably not going to be executed perfectly, but our singular focus is on getting results. We may have to look at the plan and change things from time to time. We may have to do something else to increase revenue, something else to reduce expenses. So we're constantly focused on the idea of keeping that value as high as possible. The asset manager may have a very specific strategy for a building, and each building has a very different strategy. In some cases, the company may buy a building because it's stable. They may buy a building that has a single tenant with a 10 or 15-year lease, and they want that building because it's stable. They earn a relatively low return on that building because it is so stable. It's not a cash flow that's at risk, but people like to have stability. Other clients only go after buildings which are called value add. And what that means is that people buy those buildings because they know there are problems. Maybe there's some significant vacancy. Maybe the building needs to get renovated. They expect to be able to solve those problems, lease up the building, and create value. Sometimes firms buy buildings for the short term. And at least in the Washington, D.C. market, during the height of the market, buildings could be sold twice in the same year. And the client who bought it and then sold it again didn't do anything to the asset. Just the appreciation of the building over several months could have created enough value that the next client found it valuable to sell the building. That's a short-term hold. Sometimes the hold is long-term, and those terms are relative. Sometimes a person may say that a 10-year hold is a long-term hold, and some other folks may say, well, we want that building to be in our family for generation after generation. That's a long-term hold. So each person will tell you how long they intend to hold that piece of real estate. And then they'll have a process by which they distribute or dispose of that real estate at the end of its cycle. A classic example of that is the standalone Walgreens drugstores. Those stores are constructed by Walgreens, and as soon as the tenant moves in, the tenant signs a 99-year lease, and those stores are sold immediately. So as soon as that real estate is finished and the tenant starts to pay rent, Walgreens sells off the store to an investor, and that investor has a stable cash flow for that 99-year period of time. The question that we have to focus on is, regardless of whether it's a short-term, intermediate-term, or long-term hold, how do we maximize the value? And in some cases, we want to maximize the value at the sale, which is called the terminal value. Some cases, we want to maximize the cash flow of money that is produced every month. It really depends on the owner's strategy for the building. In our world, we live and die by what are called markets and submarkets. So in many cases, it's fair to say that a building in Washington, D.C. would be very different in the way it's managed and the characteristics than a building in New York City or Des Moines, Iowa. And ultimately, buildings that are similar to one another in the same geographic area tend to have some similarity in the way they behave. In other cases, the buildings that might be a little bit different from one another or maybe a little bit different neighborhood have different characteristics as well. So the first thing we do is we separate into what are called markets. And the market really is a metropolitan statistical area as defined by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's an area of Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York City. Those are all defined as markets. Then within those markets, there are submarkets of areas that behave similarly. So if you were to look at Washington, D.C., there's an area near Capitol Hill. There's an area north of Massachusetts Avenue called NOMA. There's the area where the new National Stadium is located. But at the same time, there's also portfolios of property in Prince George's County, Montgomery County, and in Northern Virginia encircling Washington, D.C. that are parts of the D.C. market, even though those buildings aren't in D.C. So the market might be Washington, D.C., but the submarket might be that the tenant wants to find space on Capitol Hill, and that's the market, the submarket that they're going to look for. And then another thing that makes a difference is buildings have different classes. A trophy building would be the absolute best of the best. In our marketplace, it would be new. It would be sparkling with all the technology you could imagine. Probably has a rooftop deck. Probably has parking. Might be located directly on top of a subway stop for the DC Metro. Those are the buildings that are absolute, the prime buildings, the best in the marketplace. That is the top of the market, the Cadillac. The Class A building is perfectly functional, maybe a little bit older than that, but certainly a great piece of real estate to be in. B is a little bit older building, and that might be a building that doesn't have parking. It might be a building that doesn't have the latest amenities. It might be built in the 80s and not really renovated. Those are buildings that are a little bit lower in quality, a little bit less expensive often in cost, but many tenants find that Class B buildings are perfect for their use. And then lastly, the Class C buildings would be buildings that, for whatever reason, they are the least expensive options in the marketplace. They tend to not have any modern amenities. It is used by a company that just says, look, I want an office. I really don't care about the frills. That would be a Class C property. You can make money in real estate managing any of those types and owning any of those types. It really depends what your client is all about. Some national clients, some international clients only purchase trophy buildings because they only want their name associated with the best of the best. And there's a very specific way of managing trophy buildings compared to managing Class B buildings. It's very different. It's more the Nordstrom model in the trophy building and less of that in a Class B building. So you'll find your owners will focus towards a type of real estate in general, and you'll also find that the property management companies tend to focus on different types of real estate. So here's what the asset manager's responsibilities are. If you take that back for a second and look, again, let's say that we replace the asset manager title with the owner's responsibility. And this is really what the asset manager does on behalf of the owner. They hire and oversee the property management team. They hire and oversee the leasing team, and they make the deals. So ultimately, it's the asset manager who says, yes, I will sign a lease with that tenant for that dollar value for that term. The asset manager makes that choice. The asset manager is responsible for helping to make sure all of those tenants stay in place. They are going to constantly be looking at whether they hold the building or whether they sell it. And even though they may have had a 5 or a 10-year plan, there may be things that have changed in the process that they want to sell the building before that. Most asset management companies will do an annual hold-sell analysis where they're going to make a decision about whether they should continue to keep the building in the portfolio or whether this year is going to be a good year to dispose of the asset. The asset manager is also responsible for new acquisitions, so looking and finding new buildings to purchase, and at the same time potentially handling the disposition that we're going to sell this building out of our portfolio. So they're responsible for bringing product in and letting product go. And as we said before, the whole objective here is to create value. So the asset manager is really focusing on net operating income and how do we improve the NOI? How do we make that the absolute maximum net operating income that we can produce by increasing the income and decreasing the expenses? So we'll pause for just a second and we will take an opportunity to stop for questions.
Right now on Twitter, it's just some highlights. I want to give a shout out to Erica Kennedy for tweeting some notes to her followers. I'm sure they appreciate it. And just remind people that, again, this series is about understanding how your specific job responsibility might interact with the owner. So now is your chance to ask a question that you've maybe had and haven't had the chance to ask anybody, or if you haven't interacted with the owner and you're curious on how they specifically involve you or your current job responsibility. So we wanted to make sure there was plenty of time for audience interaction. So feel free to ask questions. That's what Mark's here for, so don't be nervous. And if you don't feel like talking, just submit it via the chat box and we'll find those too.
All right. Well, I have a few questions here, Mark, that I've either collected from people that have sent emails prior to the webinar or that I think may be helpful to the audience during today's session. Is there a time or location, either during the initial, write-up of when an owner is looking to develop a building, or during the construction phase? Is there a time where you think it works best, or an avenue in which an owner or an asset manager could state their long-term or short-term goals for a property so that everybody within the construction and design and build side have a better understanding of what the end result of the building is besides just its appearance?
I think first of all, let me address Caitlin's thoughts for just a second too. And I think one of the main points here is it's entirely possible that none of the people on this call will ever have a communication with the owner. It's a little bit more likely, but not necessarily highly likely, that you'll have a direct conversation with the asset manager. In most cases, your in is going to be the property manager or the leasing team. I don't do new construction, so that I think is a little bit different. We do a lot of tenant fit out and a lot of interior construction work. That's our primary, that plus building systems like replacing rooftop units and HVAC equipment, replacing the roof and things like that. In those cases, the decision to choose a designer, an architect, an engineer, usually comes from either the property management team, the leasing agents, or the tenant may bring somebody with him. In most cases, we will establish that there is a building-specific architect that holds our drawings and makes sure that we have current CAD drawings of everything in the building. They may not ultimately do the design for a tenant space because the tenant may bring their own designer in, but ultimately when that project is finished, our main base building drawings are updated so that we have an accurate view of the building. Oftentimes, we have the ability to control that on the property management side. In some cases, the leasing agent may have a preferred design firm that they might work with. Same with construction companies. We have generally a list of preferred contractors, and we'll use that list to obtain competitive bids for those construction projects. The opportunity to even interface with an asset manager is probably not going to be there, and to interface with the owner is very unusual in our business because that owner is oftentimes 2 steps removed from the property manager. So there are many clients where I've talked to the asset manager on a daily basis, but I have never ever spoken with anybody at the ownership side because that's a level removed from where we are.
And then Matt, it looks like we have a few questions coming in. Karen Hill asks, what have you seen with regard to how building owners or asset managers are dealing with the new code requirements for annual inspection of fire doors? This seems to be a hot topic. Are you budgeting for this? And do they know who to go to get the inspections completed? So that was kind of a multi-point question, so let me know if you need me to repeat it.
Well, I'm looking at it right now, so we're good.
Oh, great.
I think, first of all, one of the discussion points here could be the involvement of BOMA International. And when we started off the discussion, there was a mention that BOMA has helped to align me with CSI to help put this presentation on. BOMA is a trade organization that represents owners and managers of real estate. there's an entire group of people within BOMA International, as well as in the local BOMA associations around the country, that specialize in codes and standards. So in many cases, BOMA has a seat at the table when these kind of regulations are coming through the process. Oftentimes these changes are being made fully with the support of BOMA in a way that makes it able to be implemented. Sometimes if you were to let the code officials to pass through what they'd like to pass through, sometimes it would be impossible for our ownership groups to comply very quickly. So BOMA is at the table to make sure that what comes out of the process is something that's workable based upon the constituency that it has. So first of all, it really is up to BOMA, and it's up to the trade organizations. One of the great things they do is then educate their members about the new legislation or new regulations. So I say first and foremost, how are they doing with it? I think the first step is that BOMA is out doing the educational sessions to make sure everybody knows about the changes. The local jurisdictions, at least here locally, have communicated with us in several different methods to let us know about the changes. They are, and the clients are kind of across the board. Are they budgeting for it? I think in some cases they are. Certainly the bigger institutional clients are doing that. In the smaller clients who may not know necessarily about it, may not understand those code changes, those folks may not be budgeting. At the end of the day, it most likely turns out to be a you must do this year kind of thing, and without regard to the budget, it may be something that the client is going to ultimately have to absorb the cost to do so.
All right. Thank you for that, Mark. Additionally, there's another question that had come in here. George Dunker asks if you could go over more of the scenario you mentioned concerning Walgreens and the idea of the tenant process and how that might affect the overall building scope and the owner and asset manager's involvement in that.
So in general, a Walgreens store is a Walgreens store is a Walgreens store. There are some subtle differences between stores in many cases to comply with local codes and standards, sometimes to fit into a neighborhood differently. The facade may be a little bit different, but in general, that is as cookie cutter an asset as you possibly could think of. The Walgreens drugstore here looks pretty close to the one that's over there. They have a couple of different models that they use, but for this, by and large, they build the same thing over and over again, repeatedly across the country. So the idea behind it is that it's really easy for them to construct a store, and basically they don't want to hold the real estate asset. So they would have a substantial amount of cash or a substantial amount of money tied up in holding real estate, and they want to use that money to advance Walgreens expansion, as opposed to being an owner of many, many little Walgreens stores. So the client will typically, Walgreens will typically sign a lease for that store for an extended period of time, and the owner of the building will be able to receive rent for that entire period. The leases themselves are called triple net leases, which means that the tenant is responsible for everything that happens on the site. When it's time to replace the roof, the tenant does it. The tenant does snow removal. The tenant does asphalt repairs. The tenant's responsible for all of the costs. And the way it works is the purchaser of that real estate then gets a monthly check from the tenant for their rent payment. It is basically described in many ways as coupon clipping, because you have a 99-year lease deal and you have a very, very stable tenant on a national basis that's going to be in that building for 99 years. There's very, very little risk for the people who purchase those buildings, and the risk and return are directly related to one another. The fact that there's very low risk to this means that there's a very low return. So it's almost like a bond in the sense that it's a stable return. It's not very high, but you can count on it. Where, as opposed to a building where maybe there's some substantial renovations that have to be done, and that client is going to have to invest a lot of money and take a big chance that that building is going to be able to be repositioned, that client is going to make a substantial return because of the fact that there's so much risk there. And if they can't make that return, they wouldn't have purchased the building in the first place, because no one would take the giant risk for such a small return. So in many ways, buying a Walgreens drugstore is a very, very simple real estate transaction that has a very low but very stable cash flow that the person can count on every month.
We have another question here from Nidhi. Seta is asking, what is the role of an architect in maintaining the relationship with the asset manager or owner?
In our world, again, not doing new construction, but doing interior fit-out work, usually the asset manager doesn't get involved with the architect at all. Usually that's a decision that's made by the property management company. In some cases, since we don't necessarily, Cassidy Turley does not own real estate, we actually manage on behalf of other parties. Sometimes there's an architect already assigned to the building. It may be the base building architect, it may have been an architect that was added at some point in the past, but ultimately we may walk in the door and there's a firm already there that has the entire building on CAD. Oftentimes we will not switch from that architect, we'll allow that architect to stay in place. But usually the property management as well as the leasing teams work together to choose an architect for an assignment, or the tenant has a connection with that particular architect, and we introduce the architect to the process that way. I don't know too many asset managers that get deep into the details with the architect, and I certainly know that most of the architects I've ever worked with don't have any connection with the owner at all. So I guess the best thing to do in our world around here, the best thing to do is be in contact with those property managers, be in contact with the construction management department, be in contact with the leasing teams, and that to me is the best way to get in the door based upon my experience in the business.
Great. We have another question here, Mark, that I had received prior to today's webinar asking, and I'll kind of change it up a little bit here to address the answer you just gave. So I guess in the case of the project manager instead of specifically asset manager or owner, is there a specific member, quote unquote, of the overall project team that we're trying to introduce in this session that you think is the best relationship to maintain?
I think, and my experience over my career has been that the relationships are built with the property management company. And for that reason, we will often receive calls from, in most cases, it's architecture, engineering, and perhaps construction companies. So those folks are connecting with the clients. To give you an example, Cassidy Turley manages about 36 million square feet, 34 million square feet in the Washington, D.C. market. We manage a bit of square footage in Baltimore. We manage a little bit more than 400 million square feet across the country. Staying in contact with our Washington, D.C. based management staff helps you to get in front of the clients for that 34 million square foot portfolio. Rather than try to chase the clients who may only have one building in D.C., it's probably better to focus your attention working on the property management companies. And if you're able to continue to work with those folks, they will bring you into the door and they will introduce you around to their clients as they get new and different clients. Over the course of time, the buildings are going to be added and subtracted from the portfolio. So sometimes the building gets picked up. Maybe we win a new assignment and now we're getting 1 million square feet of new business. If you've done good work for us on another assignment, it's entirely possible that that manager is going to take you over to the next assignment. On the other hand, as a third-party manager, all of our business is on a 30-day contract. So every building in our portfolio could disappear with 30 days' notice. We focus our attention on keeping those clients, but sometimes the building sells. And when the building sells, someone else comes in to manage it. Ultimately, there's going to be some changes along the way, but when you get in really well with the management team, when you've done really good work, that management team will often take you to other assignments along the way. In some cases, too, companies have a project management group or a construction management group. Depends on the company, what they call it and how they use it. In some cases, the property manager is not involved in the construction process at all. And if that's the case, that same connection would be with the project management and construction management people. Those are typically the people who decide what vendors to use, and they're the people who are going to help you get in the door with other clients around the area. The same thing, that particular project manager may work with many, many different clients across a market. If you have developed a good relationship with that person will carry you to the next assignment and the next assignment and the next assignment. I think it's at the same time in our marketplace, we have some owner managers. So in those cases, you could certainly approach those owner-managers as a way of building a business line. The owner-manager would probably have in-house property management, probably have in-house construction or project management, and you'd be able to approach that owner-manager and potentially do work for them across the portfolio, but that's not a third-party transaction. That would be an owner-manager transaction, and that would work really well. If it's not an owner-manager situation, you're probably not going to ever talk to the asset manager or the owner behind the asset manager, just because of the logistics of how the projects work.
Now, Mark, with a non-income producing property, is the owner more involved, or are you still more likely to go through a third party or representative?
It depends. Certainly we do a fair amount of management for GSA and for the government. We do a fair amount of management for nonprofits. Don't know that we do a lot of schools and churches, but we do certainly management of other buildings that are kind of unusual. And sometimes it's third party and sometimes it's first party. So sometimes you're dealing directly with the school or the church or the government building. In some cases, you may be dealing with groups that are not very sophisticated. So if you go to your average nonprofit and your nonprofit wants to do some construction in their building, there's not often going to be a knowledgeable person on staff who is able to step up and be your liaison and give you the real feedback that you'd get by working with a professional project manager. So in those assignments, you would usually be prepared to do a little bit more legwork and a lot more hand-holding along the way. Certainly getting in with GSA and being on the GSA schedule and being able to do GSA projects or state or local government projects, that's an entire business line into itself. The rules for connectivity and the ways to connect to those folks and to get on the bid lists, that's very different than anything we've talked about so far. And there are many companies that specialize in that work. So that can be a very lucrative area of construction, but it's very different than what we're talking about here. And the same thing with the schools and the churches, the same thing with the nonprofit organizations. Sometimes you're going to work directly with them, but if that's the case, you're probably working with the director of HR or the finance guy, and you're trying to figure out how to do this project, but you're talking to somebody on the other side of the table who has no idea what you're speaking about. Those are also somewhat difficult for you to try to do the marketing with those folks, because if you look in D.C., how many associations are there? How many nonprofit organizations are based in the D.C. market? It would be a very difficult situation for you to market to all of those people individually. There is certainly a trade group that potentially you could get to help get to those folks. It makes it a little bit more difficult. The benefit of going into a project management firm or a property management firm is there's a substantial amount of square footage in one place, so you can hit a bigger home run there, as opposed to having to chase every single association and try to find out what their plans are.
Great, thanks. Now, before this webinar, we actually asked a question or started a discussion topic on our Young Professionals LinkedIn group, and it was what you wish you knew about the owner's role in a project. Now, from you being on the other side of that perspective, what do you wish other occupations or other job responsibilities, what do you wish they knew about the owner's role in the project, or what's the one thing or the one question you get asked a lot that you wish everyone knew?
I think, and I don't think I answered a question that came up a little while ago, but I think that one of the first things to really pay attention to is what is the owner's goal for the project? What's the owner's, what's their plan? And what's the strategy? And you should be able to get that from your property manager. You should be able to get it from your leasing agent. You should be able to get it from the project manager. And understanding that piece is really important, because that affects how you approach your construction. It affects how we approach design. There may be a situation where we have a certain allowance and the tenant has been given a certain dollar value to do that project. And then the tenant is going to pay for anything above that amount. If the tenant says to you, we want it to be absolutely amazing, go crazy, we want all of this fantastic interior build-out done, then you have the ability to do that. Most of the time, the landlord is going to, in that sense, allow the tenant to do whatever they want to, because above that allowance, it's the tenant's responsibility. On the other side, when it's a turnkey project and we're giving the control over to the construction contractor, there's a really important message, which is to kind of manage that project to meet the budget that's been established, because all of the profitability, all of the value creation that we've told the owner we were going to deliver is based upon that construction price coming in at the right number. So one of the challenges is to really understand what the owner's role and what their plan is, as well as what the tenant's plan is. So if you know that you've got a bare bones build out that you're doing for a tenant that really is concerned about cost, that you're going to look at certain fixtures and certain design elements one way. If you get the impression that, boy, there's no end, we'll do whatever we want to, we really want this to be spectacular, then you can take those design elements and you can show them a little differently. Much of my job is showing value creation opportunities for the client, or showing opportunities for the tenant to potentially save money in the construction costs. So what can we do differently? We've got this design, but can we get some economies of scale? Can we get some efficiencies? Can we do something differently here to be more efficient? The other thing I think that's happening a lot is the tenants are putting more people in fewer square feet. So the concept of being able to adapt to the space needs of the tenants, I think, is something that we talk about a lot during those initial contacts with our architecture folks. And then even the most stalwart companies are thinking about team rooms and thinking about places for people to congregate very differently than they did 10 or 15 years ago. So being able to come to the table and talk about all of those concepts, and I guess the last piece I would say is there's sometimes a disconnect between generations, that you may have the person making the decision may be an older baby boomer, but you're designing space that is designed to be attractive to Gen X and Gen Y, who are going to be there for the long term. And sometimes it's a discrepancy between having that baby boomer understand that hard wall offices may not be the way to go, and that an open space environment may be something that works better. The idea of having a collaboration area, the idea of having a coffee spot, all of those things appeal to Gen X and Gen Y, but they may not be thought about from the person who's actually designing the space on behalf of the tenant.
Great, thank you. Matt, did you have any other questions on your end?
I'm going to have one last question to create the segue to the end of today's session. So, Mark, if you quickly sum up, what do you see as the connection between the owner, property manager, asset manager, and next month's topic, the facility manager?
Well, I think in many cases the job is the same between a property manager and a facility manager. In most cases, the property manager is going to be responsible for management of the building, the common areas. In the case of a facility manager, that person's responsible for the tenants who occupy the building. So the property manager would be responsible for snow removal and landscaping and janitorial service and those kind of things, but the facility manager would be responsible for all of those things as well, but they also would be responsible perhaps for the mailroom, perhaps for the phone system. They would be responsible for coordinating moves, people from one place to another. It's a much different job. In most cases, our group would report to an asset manager who reports to an owner. The facility management team is part of a company, and they work to help the company use the real estate effectively. So very similar backgrounds, but very different jobs from day to day.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Mark. So with that, again, appreciate on behalf of today's audience and whoever will listen to this webinar in the future, and on behalf of CSI, again, also, thank you very much, Mark, for your input and helping us to finally understand the owner, as it may be, from today's topic. So with that, as you can see on the slide, there are a few upcoming events. Next month's topic, as we will be doing these monthly, will be hopefully understanding the facility manager. We are still working on 1 or 2 speakers for that session, but it'll be, again, the third Thursday of the month, again from 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern. You can see here some general information about the call, but look for an email and postings on both Twitter and LinkedIn for the registration link for that webinar as well. And with that, lastly then, feel free to reach out to us. You can see here on the screen who we are in representation of CSI staff, as well as our direct email and Twitter to get a hold of us for any comments, conversations, suggestions, you name it. If it's about this or anything else, we'd be happy to talk to you, and we look forward to seeing you all at upcoming meetings. So Caitlin, I'll let you close off for today.
And with that, we want to thank you guys for coming for our first ever live webinar in this YPS series. And Mark, can't thank you enough for taking the time to talk to us about the mysterious entity which is the owner. So I hope you all have a wonderful week and join us next month.